I will let you mark in these black Bibles. If you have your own Bible and want to mark in it, please turn to the very first table of contents. This is where we're going to begin. This is the literature, Old Testament in literature. The Old Testament is divided up. It's a collection of 39 different books. How many in the New Testament? The Old Testament,
66 total.
66 total books in the entire Bible. If you have 39 in the New, or the Old Testament, how many in the New? 27. So you have 39 books that we're going to look at in the next several, whatever Sundays. They're usually broken down into genres, types. There's the law, there's history, there's prophecy, there's poetry. There's poetry in the Old Testament. How many people know there's poetry in the Old Testament?
Of course.
How many people know there's songs in the Old Testament? Yes, there's actually parts of the Old Testament as we read it.
There's about 24% that's poetry.
Yeah. How about the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want?
I love that one.
Yeah? Sing it.
Lord, sing it?
It's a song.
Oh, no, that's a different song.
It's a different song, but you know what? That is a song. It's meant to be sung. We don't sing them very often, but they're meant to be sung. So when you look at some of these things, is it poetry? So there are many different parts. There's historical, there's genealogies. How many people love reading genealogies?
Oh, no. That's my favorite.
That's your favorite part?
That's
You're in the
family.
Yeah, the family. He begat this person, he born this one, he born this one, he born this one, right? How many people think that really, really, really is important?
The what? Genealogy?
Yes.
Yeah, they did.
Give me
Tell us why.
Give me a reason why, Larry, that the genealogies are important to us today. What do we get out of reading the genealogies?
You understand where everybody came from, where the line, where God's Word told you about everything that was going to happen in the future, and where the line of the family, where it all started from, and how God guided these people through their life and brought these people together and joined them to make this person, and then these people to bring this person together.
And why is that important to me?
Because we have to find out where it all started before Jesus came. We have to find out where Jesus came from, all the way back.
So it shows me God's hand throughout history to get to Jesus. I got that one. I'll give you another one. How many different details does a genealogy show God had to control in order to get Jesus where he was? Can you imagine? Think about this. Just think about just one generation. I have to get a specific child with a specific disposition who has a particular like or training or gift that has to be born, and it has to be between this person, and this person is belonged to that family, and this person is 300 miles away over on that side, and I got to get these two people together, and they have to fall in love somehow. They have to get together. They have to join. They have to be with each other intimately. They have to have a child, and this child has to survive. No diseases, no stillbornness, no problem, and actually meet another person who's another place, and they have to meet. On and on and on for generation. What does that say about God?
He's a gigantic chess player.
He's a gigantic chess player. He is very patient.
He's into detail.
He is extremely into detail, every little itty-bitty bit. Do you know what? If you ever pick one of those guys, find a name. See if it ever shows up again in all of the Old Testament.
Probably not.
Why? What is it? What would it matter to you that Johaz was ever born and produced Zerubbabel? What would it matter to you? It wouldn't. It wouldn't to me.
Yeah, because it could an argument between one family and another could bring a marriage together and create someone else.
Do you know what? You know what? I may be a Zubala. You may be a Zubala. You are a name in all of history. Nothing else. And your only purpose, if someone was to write your history, your purpose, your function into history, is that you gave birth to Cheyenne. Or that you married so-and-so. And then your name's never again mentioned. But that tells me that God knows you by name. And picked you. And placed you. And your life and who you are with and what is going on. God is intimately involved with that life. So when we are in a mess, or we are in a place of not knowing what's going on, or we are even in a joyful place, we know that God is intimately involved in my life right here, right now, and He cares even more than I do about my kids, about what they do, how they grow up, He loves them. I pray more than He loves me, more than I love them. He's involved in every little itty-bitty detail because He still has a plan, and it's not finished. You know Jesus is coming back.
Amen.
You know that there are going to be people who are going to be in heaven. Yes?
Soon.
Are they all ready now?
Not finished yet.
Not finished yet. Has everybody heard the gospel that needs to hear the gospel that's going to go and be in heaven? Then God is still working in the itty-bitty details of itty-bitty lives, in the little minutiae, the little itty-bitty details of everything, to ensure that His plan in the end takes place. Doesn't that give you comfort at times? Don't you ever stop and think, wow, you know what? God works in every little bitty thing. There's nothing that is too small that I can't take to my God.
Amen.
He's involved, patiently involved in the little stuff. And that's important. So, where was I?
You know, I didn't realize till recently that through David's descendants, that was promised to him, Jesus came, but it wasn't through Mary that I always thought. It was Joseph who actually had nothing to do with Jesus' birth.
Well, he was able to become king, eligible to be king of Israel through Joseph because of the way the laws were written, whether or not you could have a son on the throne, and whether he had to
No, I'm talking about Joseph, Jesus married to Mary.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
But he wasn't the descendant. Jesus was not his descendant.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say.
Right, but Jesus could fulfill the kingship of Israel, and like David did, because Joseph was his stepdad or whatever.
Well, they both had lineage back.
Yeah.
Both Mary and Joseph had lineage back.
They did?
Yeah.
I only thought
They both did. If Matthew goes back through one of the lineages, and I think Luke goes back through the other one, if I'm not mistaken. But anyway,
Joseph was a descendant of David.
since we're looking at the table of contents, if you have a pencil, the first 17, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. If you want to mark those, that is pretty much the complete history of the Old Testament. And it's pretty much in chronological order.
You started with what?
Started with Genesis and go through Esther. It's the first 17 books. Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon would be called the writings of God's people. So the first 17 is the story of God's people. The next 5 are the writings of God's people. This would be like your wise sayings, your songs, things of that sort. They fit into the first 17 books somewhere.
We're sharing a pencil.
Okay.
So, through Esther is the history, and what's the next one?
The next one is Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. Those are called the writings of God's people. And then the last 17 books if I counted right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Yes, last 17 books are the prophets who spoke among God's people. So, starting with Isaiah and working through Malachi. This is part of the hardest part of the Old Testament, I think, or the most confusing part of the Old Testament, is trying to figure out what goes where. Because as you're reading through this, we're used to reading a book in chronological order. The story says, once upon a time, and then you have a series of events, and you have a climax, you have a resolution, and then you have the end. And we think we should be done with the book. Old Testament is the first 17 books. When you finish with Esther, that's pretty much the end of the Old Testament's history. In between that time, you have Job, you have Psalm. Much of David's writing is in the Psalm. Proverb is a lot of Solomon. David's son is in that. Well, that's 2 Kings, 1 Kings, 2 Samuel. That's during those time frames. So a lot of what we read later after Esther actually fits into the first 17 books. Okay? Authorship of the Old Testament. We have about 30 or so different men. Some people we don't know. We have how many authors total? I mean, the actual author. Who authored the Old Testament? God. So there's one divine author through about 30 different people. It's written predominantly in Hebrew, but there's some Aramaic in it. Okay, which is another language. It was written across about 1,000 years worth of time. So about 1500 BC before Christ, 1500 years before Christ, that's about the time of Moses, the Exodus, till about 400 BC, which is about the time that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Malachi are written. So if you're looking at the books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are probably some of the first books written, actual penned. And then you have Malachi and Ezra and Nehemiah written at the other end of the history line. We don't know when Job was written. He was probably written around the same time that Genesis and Exodus and all that went on. How did we get the Old Testament? How did we get the Old Testament? Yeah, okay, once Jeremiah wrote down his stuff, what happened? Well,
it was copied.
Oh, thrown into the
very
fire.
accurately.
It was copied. It was copied. Scribes writ it. Jeremiah had a scribe. In fact, it was about his only convert during the entire time that he lived. So Jeremiah is writing and doing all these prophecies, and he has a scribe, someone who's writing, that is sitting there writing it by hand on paper. Or scroll. Well, papyrus, whatever they wrote on. So he's writing these things down. And then that is then translated by people who knew the language of the time. And about 200, 300 BC, before Jesus shows up, the entire collection of the Old Testament, the canon of the Old Testament, is actually translated as one whole piece into Greek. So when Jesus shows up, Paul the Apostle and Peter in the New Testament shows up, they are reading the Old Testament primarily from the Greek. It's called the Septuagint. Everybody heard that word before? Septuagint? Yeah. It was the Greek Old Testament.
Do we know for a fact which books were in there?
Yes, it's what we have currently. The apocryphal books were not in there.
Not in there.
No.
And then we're not finding any new Dead Sea Scrolls or anything
that would add at all. No. Here's one of the things. How many people have ever heard, oh, you can't believe the Old Testament because, how many people have ever played telephone? Yeah. You have this big long line and I whisper in your ear, and you tell that person, you tell that person, you tell that person. By the time it gets over back here to Esther, Esther has a totally different story. Does that apply?
No.
Why?
Because this matches directly to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Besides that, if we never had the Dead Sea Scrolls, Peter, don't raise your hand. I know you know the answer.
It'd have to be a miracle.
It would have to be a miracle.
God was the maker of all this.
God was the maker of it. All these things are true, but this is not the reason. The reason why the telephone analogy, you ever heard that? You can't believe the Bible because, someone told someone.
You have to understand that they said it around the campfires every night, and they like that.
No. The reason why it won't work is because the thought is that I translate the Bible. I write it down. And then she writes it down from some other source. And then she writes hers down from some other source. And he writes it from some other source. And so you get them all down. We're all from different sources and none of it matches. But that's not what happened. I didn't pass it on to her. And she took what my translation is. She tried to figure it out and translate it. And then went to her and she translated it. And she's translating her translation and vice versa. What it is I take the Greek Septuagint. I take the old original documents and I translate it. And you, years later, go back to the original Septuagint and you translate from the original language. You go back to the original language and you translate it. You go back and you translate it. Is it the same thing as if I tell her and you tell her and you tell him? No, it doesn't. It doesn't work.
Well,
because we're all using the same source.
I think the argument though goes back to before. In other words, by the time it got written, it had already been through the telescope.
And even that has a lot of the same holes. So let me give you a history. We're going to look at the Old Testament as history, and then we're going to stop at the end of the history part, and that'll be it for the day. Here's a history. I'm going to give you a history of the Old Testament. All right? From start to finish. We already said it was God first, right? Okay. Here we go. In the beginning, nothing, then something. That's how the New Testament begins, or Old Testament begins. Thank you for coming. Have a nice day. Bye. No. So in the beginning, nothing produces something. We already have problems if you have problems with that. Does modern day science have a problem with that one statement?
Mm-hmm.
Sure it is. But do you know what? If anybody has been watching my nieces on Facebook, she's the business on evolution. I asked her a question. I said, and she's been going back and forth answering questions. She's a graduate of UC Davis. If you get a chance to go play with her mind a little bit in microbiology and biochemistry, she would love for you to go play with her on this idea of you don't have to believe evolution. Yes, ask her questions. Give her questions.
They're not going to see her.
You can come. You find me. If you're on with me, you can find me, and then you can find her.
I'm friends with her now, so you can.
Or you can go through Phyllis. She's very down to earth, but my question to her is, you're worrying about where Earth began. When did the universe come into being? Well, my question is where did the matter and the energy come into being that created the thing that became the universe, et cetera, et cetera? What was before? That is always evolutionists' problem. They can't say where it came before.
So, if everyone starts, believing, everything she's studied and everything, would that, change the whole science curriculum thing at school or something? Sure.
Actually, yes, it would. It would go back to where it was probably less than 100 years ago.
100 years ago.
100 years ago, you would not be reading what we're reading today. 150 years ago. You would be reading in the beginning God. And they would go, everybody knows that. It's just a matter of fact.
When did the Dead Sea Scrolls get discovered?
I don't know. I believe it was in the 1800s or early 1900s.
Tell Nicole what the
Dead Sea Scrolls were scrolls that were parts of... Yeah. It was long.
Yeah, it was real recent.
Oh, it was after Second World War?
The 1940s.
Okay, 1940s. So that's still 60, almost 70 years ago. So it was a while. But they pulled them out, looked at how old they were in this archaeological find, and found that the Bible and it was mostly New Testament, wasn't it? Old Testament? Okay, so Old Testament, it was very, very few errors and differences, just a couple words different. But other than that, no major differences in theology.
99% pure.
Yeah, which was amazing. It was an amazing find.
They said about 400 years past the beginning of the Bible writings. These urns were about 400 years from that time.
Okay.
So they were pretty accurate.
So they're in the BC time frame. So pretty impressive. So in the beginning, God. You can just stop right there. If you don't believe that, you're not even in the same category with Christians. Next, there's creation, life, creatures. Man is made in God's image. And we'll get back to that. Who was made in man's image?
Woman.
Who was made in man's image?
I'm sorry. Who was made in God's image? I'm sorry. Who was made in man's image?
Adam.
Woman.
Woman.
Oh.
What? Oh.
Yeah. See, I was waiting for somebody to do that. We often say, and it's very, you hear it in evangelical churches all the time. You hear we've got to love one another, respect one another, sanctified. Your life is precious because we are all made in God's image. Well, sorry, that's not New Testament or Old Testament. Old Testament says it was man who was made in God's image, and out of man was made woman. And then Paul, in the New Testament, uses that argument to give reason for the positions and the headship of man over woman. That man was created for God, but woman was created for man.
Amen.
Who's going to throw something at me?
Not the men.
So I'm just saying, we want to I want to be careful. I don't want to step on people's toes, but I just want to show you how much we've moved from Old Testament stuff. Okay, so we have then the Garden of Eden. It quickly becomes the location for the fall. We have the fall of man. Sin and death enter creation. Humankind degenerate over many generations, and we get to the time of Noah. There's a great flood. God wipes out everything, saves Noah and a small remnant of his family, and that's it. New day, and we have the Tower of Babel after that. And you have the result. There's division. Languages are all confused. God spreads all the races throughout the known world into Europe, into Russia, into the Middle East, further out towards China, down into Africa, and that's where we get all of our different races and ethnicities, and et cetera, et cetera. And then we have a new covenant, a new time. God's picking out of man. He picks a pagan man. What's a pagan? Non-believer. He pulls a pagan out. His name is Abram. He says, Abram, I'm going to make a covenant with you. You're going to be my man. I'm going to make something special through you to the rest of the world. See, we forget that part of the covenant. The covenant is not just to Abraham and Abraham's children. It is to Abraham, to his children, and the rest of the world. It was big. So that's that one. And he promises his descendants that there would be a Savior. Then Abraham's wealth and prosperity turns to Israel's slavery. Where does Israel's descendants end up? In Egypt as slaves. About 400 years, they get down there. Then along comes Moses. You have the Exodus. He pulls them out. God delivers them. God gives Israel the law and then takes them to the promised land. Right? Back to fulfill the Abraham covenant. Well, Israel disbelieves God's word. Says, we can't get the land. There's no way it's going to happen. And so God makes them wander around until that entire generation falls dead for about 38 plus 40 years. Except for Caleb and Joshua, Aaron, and Moses. He did not die after the 40 years. He got all the way to the promised land and was able to see. So, from across the river. Yeah, he went up on the mountain, he looked across the river. He wasn't allowed to go in the promised land because he sinned. That's right. So Israel, he finally goes into the promised land through Joshua. There's a partial conquering of the land, a spreading and dividing of the territories. And then you have a series of about 360 some odd years where Israel goes through this cycle. They love the Lord, following the Lord. Oh, they fall away, fall away, fall away, fall away. Oh, God sends somebody to overcome and impress them, and they start whining. Oh, God deliver us, God deliver us, God deliver us. He sends a judge, or what's the other name for a judge? Deliverer. He brings a deliverer. Someone is usually a military person of some sort. Comes in, rescues them. They all say, thank you, thank you, thank you. And they have a bunch of peace for several years, and it goes back in the same cycle again and again and again and again. That's judges. Then eventually we have the establishment of the kingdoms. There's a kingdom that's a total kingdom. It starts with Saul, but it's finalized in David, King David, the one king. We have a new covenant that is created through David for the Christ, that God will place his king through David's line on the throne forever and ever and ever and ever, and all power and everyone will bow to him. He will be the ultimate king, God's appointed, anointed one, through David. That was the promise, through David. David has a son, Solomon, wisest man that ever lived. Have his rule. His kingdom gets bigger and bigger. He builds the temple. Thank you very much. And we understand that now we have God specifically in one place with mankind. And we have all the temple stuff going on. After the temple, after Solomon dies, Israel is split into two. There's the northern part. That's called what? Israel. It kept the same name as the nation, Israel. The southern part became what? Judah. And they had two kings, a king in the north, a king in the south. By the time you get to the kings and you're going through all that, you have this, Ahab did such and such and such, and then you have Jehoiakim and he did whatever. I mean, I don't remember the names. But you have a king here, and in the next chapter you have a king, different king, and you go, well, what's that? I thought we were just talking about Israel. Now you're talking about Judah. I thought, aren't they the same thing? No. He's talking about the northern kingdom, what's going on in the northern kingdom. Then he goes down and he talks about the southern kingdom. Then he goes back up and talks about the northern kingdom, and you go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And you have to know what you're talking about. After that, idolatry goes. Assyria comes in from the north area, and comes down and wipes out completely 10 tribes that comprised Israel, the northern kingdom. Now, we have a problem, though, because in Revelation it says that God will have 12,000 witnesses from each of the 12 tribes in the end time. And there'll be 144,000 witnesses of Israel. Well, if 10 of the tribes are wiped out, where are they going to find 12,000 of all of those tribes that were wiped out?
That was the original tribes.
Yes. And we're going to get, from what I understand, 12,000 of each of the original tribes that are going to be witnesses in Israel during the time of the end times. 144,000. Where are they going to come from? Glad you asked. During the time when Assyria's coming down and they're starting to mess and they're winning battles, taking cities, there was a migration from the northern kingdoms. The people of the northern kingdom, they came down and lived in the south. So in the south, you have all 12 tribes by the time the north is killed off. That's how we're going to get more deal. Now, we have some people who believe that the 10 tribes migrated across some land barrier that came across and landed in the United States area, in the Americas, and that the Indians or the Mormons are part of the lost tribes of Israel. Yeah, whatever. Okay, anyway, so that's that. You have Northern Kingdom. That's about 722 BC. They're all wiped out. Now, in the bottom, Southern Kingdom has a couple good kings. Northern Kingdom, no good kings. Southern Kingdom, a couple. So they last a little bit longer, about 605 BC.
Wasn't that the promise that God made to Solomon, because Solomon sinned, that he would wipe out, take all the power away from him, and he would only have like a small little territory left? Isn't that part of the
I don't know that particular prophecy was. Well, I wouldn't doubt that there's. I don't know that particular portion of Scripture.
I was reading at the end of Solomon's life how because he sinned, God through his prophet said that
The kingdom.
Basically took it all away.
Well, it's possible. I don't know. When we get to that particular section, if you can find it, let's find it and let's read it. And if it just be a confirmation that God did what He said He was going to do, which is good. So we get to the part where you have the northern kingdom has already been wiped out. Southern kingdom, who takes over southern kingdom? What's that big long name? Nebuchadnezzar. Yes. Nebuchadnezzar is from Babylon. Where's Babylon? Iraq. If you look at today, it's Iraq. So the southern part of Iraq, right next to the Euphrates River, this big king of
Babylon the Great.
we're not going to go there. He comes across, there's this battle between Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Egypt over Judah. And it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth for about 3 to 5 years, and all of a sudden Nebuchadnezzar says, you know what? Phooey. Forget this. Comes in, wipes out a big battle with Egypt, and just wipes out all of the southern kingdom. Takes them all out, and they are exiled out of Egypt, or out of Israel, and they go to Babylon. Who remembers anybody that's was over in Babylon? Daniel's one. Woo! Good job, good job. Yes. So by the time you get to Daniel, where are we in history? Northern kingdom's gone, southern kingdom has been conquered, and it's all been moved over to Babylon. All right, there is no more Israel anymore. Who's another one? Can you give me another character over in the Babylon era?
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
There you go.
Very good. What was their real name? Not their pagan, godless name. Do you know?
Too hard to pronounce. I read them.
Yeah.
You know what?
That's it, Daniel.
Azanah?
Yeah,
Yeah, go back. I can't pronounce. I don't remember them anyway. But there was.
They were princes of
Yes,
Israel.
they were very, very up there. Now here's the deal. And they were young when they went across. They weren't little kids, but they were young. They were probably a little bit older than you, probably about 19, 20 years old. But we remember their pagan names.
Because it's
easier to
Because
pronounce.
Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Shadrach. Remember that? Oh, I don't know if I remember that one. But that's how I remembered their names. Daniel remembered. Is that his pagan name?
No.
That was his
No. What was his pagan name? Belteshazzar.
Yeah.
Belteshazzar. If I remember right.
Is it Hananiah, Mishael, and
Yes.
Azariah?
Yes, very good. Woo! Yeah, exactly. Do you know what? Those names you were going back to, Nikki, you were going back to names and how names change. There's a reason why their names were changed. Each of those names is a tribute to God in some way, the real God. When they got to Babylon, they changed their names to honor the pagan gods. So Shadrach is a tribute to the god Shad, or whatever the name was. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. All of those are names to some Babylonian god.
I have a friend named Sadrach.
Sadrach? Okay. Yeah. All right, so we have Babylon off 70 years. God promises 70 years they'll be in exile. So Daniel, Nehemiah is over there, Ezra's over there. All those start in exile, and they are allowed to trickle back. Daniel probably died in exile. He never saw Jerusalem again, even though he prayed for it every day. Survivors are taken into exile for 70 years, and then God brings back a remnant to Jerusalem and rebuilds the temple in about 536 BC. The Jerusalem walls, that was Nehemiah, in about 445 BC. About 40 some odd years, about 400 BC, Malachi prophesies, and then God is quiet. And for 400 years, there's not a prophetic voice. It's the end of the Old Testament. God has brought back his remnant, a small portion, back to Israel. The temple has been rebuilt somewhat. The walls have been rebuilt somewhat. And there is some semblance of what used to be.
Is the ark around, or is it completely lost somewhere?
No, I think I found it on the other side of the world.
Nobody's ever found it.
We haven't found it.
Literally,
They keep looking for it.
in Revelation it says it comes down from heaven, so if it took that literally, then it'd be in heaven.
So we end up at the end of the Old Testament story. It's history without an ending. There is no ending to the Old Testament. The Old Testament, the people of the Old Testament, the story of the Old Testament is we're still waiting. We're still waiting for God to make good on His promise to King David, to set up His kingdom. We want that promise. We're waiting for that king. Where is He? There is no answer. The end of the Old Testament is pathetic. The people have left God. They have despised God. Go read Malachi. It is disgusting how they treat God. They're bringing warped, defective, sickening, diseased animals to God to sacrifice and thinking, God, it'll be good with God. It's good enough. This is such a burden to do this temple stuff. On and on. That's how the Old Testament ends. They're waiting for the glory to come back to Jerusalem. Now, the question is, as we go through this, when we look at this Old Testament, what do we take away from it? Is it an old story that is old and it needs to stay there? And we have a new story in Matthew. New king, Jesus, and we're done. We're happy.
It's not a new story. It's like you said, it's a fulfillment of the old story.
Well, if the end of the Old Testament is looking forward, waiting for God to fulfill His promise to David, to Abraham, to Moses, to fulfill that answer, then Israel is not apart, separate from New Testament happenings and New Testament history. It's waiting for that history to come. And when we go back and look at the Old Testament and read the Old Testament and go through the Old Testament, we need to keep that in mind, that these stories, these testimonies of God are looking forward. They want that fulfillment in the New Testament. They want that story to end. God started the story. God is going to end the story. And it's going to end better than it began. At least better for us who are in Him. So when we go through the next couple, we're going to actually sit down and we're going to open up the Bible and we're going to look at Genesis and we're going to say, okay, here is this section called the literature section or the story section. These are the 17 first books of the Bible. We're going to get the story down. We're going to look at Genesis and, okay, what is the primary information that we need to get out of Genesis? What do we need to know about that story looking forward, taking from Genesis? What does Genesis have to do with that looking forward to New Testament so we can understand the New Testament in light of Genesis and vice versa? Can we understand Genesis knowing where God was going? That's important. You have to be able to go both ways. So that's what we'll do. We'll go through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all the way through the entire Old Testament and find out where does it fit and what do we need to see looking forward into the New Testament. For instance, when we get to Leviticus 16, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago with the cup. Remember we talked about Jesus in the garden, He had the cup, and He was agonizing over it. And we said, why would He be agonizing over the cup? We had the cup of wrath. God was supposed to deal out punishment on the sacrifice. There was supposed to be a sacrifice paid for the atonement of people. Jesus had to become that sacrifice, but He also had to become the sin. He had to have the sin put upon Him. He became the scapegoat. Where is that? Leviticus 16. Well, if you don't understand or see and know Leviticus 16 and the idea of the Day of Atonement and what God has established as, a high priest that makes atonement for God's people through a sacrifice and through a scapegoat. When you get to the Garden of Gethsemane, and you see Jesus, the Son of God, weeping and just so unmasked and dripping blood over this, you go, boy, he's kind of a wimpy guy. If you don't know that what he is wrestling over is not only that he's going to feel God's wrath for the first time in all of eternity past, but he also has to become what his actual holy nature detests. He is God, holy, and he is going to have the high priest, from an analogy standpoint, put his hands on his head and put all the sin of the people onto his head, and he's going to bear it. He's going to wear it. He's going to become what he absolutely hates. And so he's saying, Lord, if there's any way, Father, if there's any way, please take this cup from me. But not my will, your will. How do you know that that was what's going on? Well, you don't if you don't know Leviticus 16. So you see the depths of the New Testament in light of what we know and understand from the Old Testament and vice versa. So that's what we'll be doing. We'll look at primary information. What do we need to know? And then practical instruction for what do you do when you're reading it. What can you take away? When you go through Leviticus, you go through those genealogies, and you're like, oh, Numbers, you got it 2 times. One in the beginning, one in the end. You got so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so and so. Oh, this is dry. Just jump to the end of the chapter and I'll pretend like I read it. Right? So where does that fit? How does that fit? That's what we will be doing. Okay? That's what we're going to be doing as quickly as we can. And then we'll look at the theological aspects of it as well as we're moving along. And that's where we're going to spend the next 4, maybe 5 Sundays, working our way through the different books, so that when you review it, you're going through it, you can see the New Testament, see where God's going, and understand where it fits. And my assumption is my goal is that when we get finished, there will be so much less of this, it's inconsistent, it's irrelevant, I don't know how to fit, I don't know how to mesh it. It's going to mesh a lot better because we're going to have a much better understanding of the total picture. It's not, this is one story, this is another story. It is one story, and God has a plan throughout the entire thing and is pointing that way. Pointing towards an end. Pointing towards Jesus, King, glorified, and all his bride loving him. That's where we're going. That's where the Old Testament is pushing. And I want to see if we can't flesh that out, if we can't get that out as we're going through the Old Testament. Just look at it. Are we anticipating that? Are we looking at that? Okay? All right? I know there's a lot of just brain stuff. It's not a lot of Bible verses and things, but I wanted to give you an idea of where we're going, why we're going there, and what to expect over the next couple weeks. Okay?